So this is what's that about the Mishnah. And the Mishnah, as we'll see, is as close as you get to kind of a founding document for Rabbinic Judaism. And a founding document for Rabbinic Judaism means that it's actually important even in Humanistic Judaism as setting some of the basic customs. What the Mishnah is not, we will also discover, is a reference manual. That is not the function of the work. We will see what the function of the work is. It's actually pretty complex. And like every document of this sort, it is also very much tied to the politics of its time. So our goals are the 5 W's and how, right? Who, what, where, when, why, and how. And there's a lot of those to answer. What is the Mishnah? Who wrote it? Compiling is actually a better way of expressing it. What's it trying to accomplish? Why it was put together? How it's used, etc. So we can answer who, where, and when very, very simply, which gives you almost no information to go with. So who, where, and when, really simple. A rabbi named Rabbi Judah HaNasi, Judah the Prince, compiled it while he was living in the Galilee around the year 200 CE, and it's written in Hebrew. Rabbi Judah HaNasi is usually just called rabbi, which is the privilege you accord yourself when you're the person who's put this work together, is you can be rabbi. None of this actually tells you very much about the Mishnah other than sort of basic census data, which isn't really all that useful for understanding what this document is. Who, where, when, as a complicated answer, is that there are literally dozens of rabbis whose teachings appear in the Mishnah from multiple generations of scholars. Some of the names you may have actually encountered before in various guises. So Hillel and Shammai, right? Tell me the entire Torah standing on one foot. That's those guys. Shammai and Avtalion, who were predecessors to them. We've already talked about the anonymous rabbi is really Judah HaNasi, who compiled the document. We have Rabban Gamliel, who may or may not in some way, shape, or form appear by reference in the New Testament. We have Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir, who are important scholars from the 130s, more or less. We have Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. So if you've heard the story of the tree that uproots itself, there's a rabbi who says, if the law goes with me, this tree will uproot itself, this river will flow backwards, this house will fall down. This is the guy that the house was falling down for, the tree was moving, the river was going backwards for. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, we have seen his name as recently as Passover. Actually, all of these folks, these last 5, appear in the traditional Haggadah. So even people who never, ever, ever will study the Mishnah or any of the other rabbinic documents still see these names if they use a traditional Haggadah and actually read past, the part where it starts to get boring. These are the guys who are sitting around arguing into the middle of the night how many plagues there were and that sort of thing. That's these folks here. Who, where, and when continued, we have a lot of them. It's a compiled document. We know there are multiple sources. The document is honest about saying different people said different things and I'm just putting them together. But there are 4 basic chronological periods. So one of them is before the destruction of the temple, before 70 CE. This is sort of the oldest layer of stuff. The next layer is post-destruction. So between 70 CE and 132 CE, and most of this happens in a town called Yavne, sometimes called Jamnia in the Galilee. We have the Bar Kokhba revolt in the middle, and then after the revolt, the rabbis get together again in or after the year 135 in Usha, also in the Galilee. And then there's a little bit of moving around to Shefar Am and then Beit She'arim, also in the Galilee. These are folks who primarily live not near Jerusalem. And they are following around a patriarch, a Nasi, and it's a generational dynasty. So these folks are all following around a primary teacher. The primary teacher, at least to listen to the rabbis say it, is the governing authority for Jews in the land of Israel at the time. He is the interface, whoever the Nasi is, he is the interface between the Roman government and Jews. We don't have a lot of contemporary historical records to prove a lot of this, so it's actually quite difficult to know up to a certain point whether what they're saying about themselves is true. These generations of rabbis, these folks who show up in the Mishnah, are all called together Tanaim, which is not a Hebrew word, it's an Aramaic word that means people who teach through repetition. So for those who are up on their Hebrew, Tav, Nun, Aleph, or Yud, or Hey in Aramaic corresponds to a Hebrew root, Shin, Nun, Hey, which means to repeat. Sometimes it means to change. So the idea behind what's in the Mishnah is that these are teachers who repeated traditions that they heard. And the Mishnah itself comes from this same root, Shin, Nun, Hey. So a Mishnah is a thing that's been repeated, a repetition. So the idea behind the Mishnah is we're just consolidating and restating the things that everybody has already said. We're doing nothing new. We're doing no interpretation. We're just telling you where the law is now. That's the conceit. That's not really what's happening, but that's the conceit. Rabbi, I will interchangeably call him Rabbi and Judah Hanasi. Judah Hanasi compiles all of these sayings together in the year 200. He's editing these things together. There's some indication that there was a pre-existing document from 135, thereabouts, that he worked with. Collects them all together while he's living in the Galilee, while he is serving as Nasi, as the patriarch, the person who somehow, though living in a fairly rural area, is representing all of the Jews living in the land of Israel to the Roman Empire. So again, are we sure? I don't know. It's written in Hebrew. It is written in Hebrew, but they don't speak Hebrew anymore at this time. They speak Aramaic. And so the Hebrew that they write is very much influenced by the Aramaic they speak, somewhat to its stylistic detriment. And we'll see a little bit of that when we look at the Mishnah itself. You don't have to know Hebrew for this to work, but I'm going to show you how some things get fuzzy with their Hebrew so that you can kind of understand how removed they really are from Hebrew as an everyday functional language. So that's our who, where, and when. So the easy version of who, where, and when was this, but actually there's a lot more to it. So that's our easy who, where, and when. The longer version is the longer version with blocks of tradition, things like that. And just like with the Tanakh, where scholars have gone and looked for sources and separated things out and tried to date them, scholars have done the same thing with the Mishnah. So the same kind of scholarship has been applied here. There are a number of scholars who do it. We should not overstate the number of scholars who do this simply because there's just not that many academics working in this field. Because as Jews, we think we're very important. Much of the rest of the world isn't so interested in the Mishnah. But Jewish scholars are, because what's in the Mishnah forms what comes later. Okay, so before we move on from that, questions? Knowing that I may defer the answer because it may be answered somewhere else.
Just a point of interest, Jeremy, that I forget what the first name of the rabbi was, but then there was Ben Hyrcanus, which is, of course, Greek.
Yeah, so that was Rabbi Eliezer, who was reputed to be one of the more strict conservative scholars. And yet his father's name is Hyrcanus, which is very obviously a Greek name, and is pronounced Hyrcanus in Hebrew, and in Greek at the time.
Was he the one, because it was only, I remember, there was only one of the rabbis who were even allowed to learn Greek and was able to learn Greek culture too. I can't remember who it was. Was this the one?
No, it was not him. However, the Talmud says there was only one who was allowed, but the reality is, if you lived in Palestine at this time and you were educated even a little, you knew Greek, because it was the language of commerce with the Romans. So you had to know it, even a little bit. So Larry?
Since the compilation of Tanakh had 500 to 700 years gone by before Mishnah was the next written document?
This could be a whole other what's that about? So there is a whole slew of material that once upon a time and still today is called by scholars the intertestamental literature. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, things that are in the Apocrypha, including the books of Maccabees and a number of other works, are all part of the intertestamental literature, noting that that name implies that they're not valuable documents. Who calls it intertestamental literature? Protestant scholars. That's where we're getting that name from. Among the pieces of what's called intertestamental literature that actually is really important to the rabbis is a book called Sirach or Ben Sira, or Ecclesiasticus. It goes by all three names. And there are parts in rabbinic literature where the rabbis cite that as though it's part of the Tanakh, even though it actually never makes it into the Tanakh, and we didn't have Hebrew copies of this thing until the 17 or 1800s. So they were using it in Hebrew at one point, and then they stopped studying it. So we have this category called intertestamental literature. We have scholars who study what they call Second Temple Judaism, which is not a useful name to give the varieties of Judaism at this time, but it's what people do. And a lot of it's written in Greek, but not all of it. So this is the who, where, and when. You want to understand a document, who, where, and when is helpful for understanding a document. So why and what? Why was the Mishnah compiled? So the Mishnah doesn't give any explanation for why it was written down. That's very typical for the Mishnah, which doesn't tend to give explanations for many things. The accepted principle at the time was that there were actually two Torahs. There was a written Torah, Torah Shebichtav, and oral Torah, which is Torah Sheba al Peh. And the Torah Sheba al Peh, the oral Torah, is not supposed to be written down. And the rabbis have a midrash that explains that when Moses is on Mount Sinai, the text says he's up there for 40 days and 40 nights. And they say, Why nights? Well, in the day, he got the written Torah, and in the nights, he got the oral Torah, and only one got written down. The oral Torah fills in these details. This is the theory. This is the operative theory that they're working on. The oral Torah fills in details that you can't quite get if you just are reading the Torah itself. You need this other stuff to be able to actually follow the rules, because all of these things that we recognize today as contradictions, duplications, redundancies, the oral Torah explains away. That's part of the function of the oral Torah, and it explains it away by finding new rules to say, they're really talking about different things. And the rule was you didn't write down the oral Torah. So we have little bits and pieces in later documents that start to explain why the rabbis thought the Mishnah was written down. And their basic premise is, and it's a theme that runs throughout the next 2,000 years of Judaism, that Torah was disappearing. People were forgetting the oral Torah. They were getting confused. They couldn't remember who said what, and so they had to write it down. Losing Torah is a bigger problem than writing it down, so we'll write it down. But we won't write it down completely. We're going to write it down in fragmentary ways, and trying to make that happen, Rabbi Judah Hanasi compiles the Mishnah. This is the story, and this is the story we get in its earliest and most cogent form in a letter written by a Babylonian rabbi, Iraqi essentially, named Sharira Gaon, who was asked by a North African Jewish community, why did the Mishnah get written? What's with all these documents? I thought we weren't supposed to write the oral Torah. Why did this happen? And his answer is about a 100-page letter. So he gave a very long answer in Aramaic, so hard to access. There is a translation of it into English. It is very hard to find. Amazon is selling it right now for about $200 for a 100-page book. It's been out of print for about 35 years. So Rav Sharira says, we're losing information. We need to write this stuff down. And this is, you can find the Hebrew version of it for free online, or the original Aramaic version. There it is. That's the cover page. What did Rabbi write? He wrote individual statements by the Tanaim, attributed to scholars from the Zugot. So Hillel and Shammai are among the Zugot. Zugot means pairs. So attributed to scholars from about 165, the Maccabean Revolt, to 200 CE, his own time. So a 350-year period. There's a lot of stuff in there. But the two biggest blocks are teachings from Yavne and teachings from Usha. So you can see most of the teaching is actually in a 100-year period. Teachings are grouped in specific ways. We'll see how, and with a specific structure, and we'll see that as well. The Mishnah's teachings aren't authoritative. The Mishnah sometimes records things that are outright wrong, and it doesn't tell you what's right and what's wrong. So its purpose is not as a reference manual. Sometimes it writes down the right answer and the wrong answers as though they're all equally valid. And when you do this, when you have the wrong answers and the right answers together and you don't say what's what, you don't have as much of a problem with writing down the oral Torah. You're just writing down notes, right? The theory that Rav Sharira gives is, oh, they were writing notes. They were just taking notes. These are their notes. This is like your class notes. Don't want to forget, these are rabbinic post-it notes that supposedly Rabbi takes, slaps together, and gives some kind of form to. What the Mishnah has to say isn't comprehensive. There are other documents and other texts written and passed down orally that preserve more traditions. Sometimes they conflict, sometimes they supplement, sometimes they explain. So there is another bunch of stuff. So we have something called the Tosefta. Tosefta means addition or extra in Aramaic, right? So Mishnah has a Hebrew name, Tosefta has an Aramaic name. Tosefta is like, oh, hey, wait, you forgot when you were putting together the Mishnah. Or that's how the tradition explains it. Baraita is a word that means outside in Aramaic. So baraitot are multiple baraitas, outside traditions that were passed on orally through the generations. From sometimes they're in written documents and sometimes they just knew them. And when you read the Talmud, you discover that they resolve a lot of arguments by saying, but there's this baraita, and you would have no way of knowing. They just kind of pull stuff out of the air, and that's part of what makes the Talmud hard to study. 6 are the orders of the Mishnah. Okay, so Chad Gadya from Passover Seder, right? Chad Gadya goes up to 12, and when you hit 6, it says 6 are the orders of the Mishnah. So it's in the Passover Seder, but we don't list the orders of the Mishnah in the Passover Seder. I have them here for you. So there's 6 orders. In the printing of the Mishnah that I have, each order has its own volume. I'm holding the first one, Zeraim, seeds, in my hand. Most of the stuff in here applies only in the land of Israel. It's agricultural stuff. It doesn't apply when you live anywhere else. But the very first part of it is Tractate Berakhot, which is not all the prayers, but a lot of them. Moed, time or seasons, covers most of the holidays. So there's a Tractate Shabbat. There's Pesachim, which is Passover. There's Rosh Hashanah, which is Rosh Hashanah. That one wasn't hard to figure out. There's Yoma. Yoma is the Aramaic word that means the day. So there's only one, the day. It's Yom Kippur. Megillot or Megillah is Purim. There's Tractate Eruvin, which is also about Shabbat, but about specific laws. We can kind of go on and on. There's a lot of them. Nashim literally means women. These are laws about women. More specifically, they are the laws that govern women's lives from outside, written by men. I feel like I have to say that. But marriage contracts, divorce, certain kinds of oaths, that's what's in Nashim. Nezikin is damages, primarily criminal and civil law, contracts, inheritance, loans, how you loan money at interest. It can be done. You just think it can't be done because everybody told you the Torah says you can't loan money at interest. The rabbis found a way. Kodashim, which means holy things, sacrificial laws, laws for running the temple. Kashrut is in Kodashim. And then Toharot, purities, rules of ritual purity and contamination. There's even a tractate in Toharot called Yadayim. Yadayim is the Hebrew word for hands. There is an entire tractate in the Mishnah whose entire purpose is to tell you how to clean your hands. Not for sanitary purposes, but for ritual purity purposes. So they get into the nitty-gritty of everyday life in a big way. Because the Torah says everything is holy, everything has a divine dimension. So you have a lot of law. Okay, so we'll stop here. Questions about any of that? Yeah. Joyce.
So what you're saying is when they were talking about 2 Torahs and the one that's written down and the one that isn't, the Mishnah is essentially the one that's not written down. Just
right.
Making sure
right.
I understand that.
Or it's the first writing down of the stuff that shouldn't be written down.
Yeah. And can any of the hand washing stuff be useful today? Just kidding.
Now, you laugh, but I have an acquaintance who is an Orthodox rabbi who actually has spent much of the last month going online during lunchtime and teaching part of Mishnah Yadayim during this time. And he says, look, it's not hand washing rules that are sanitary, blah, 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 but there are things that echo, right? Historical concerns that repeat and echo. And so yes, he seems to believe that there truly are some things that make sense here.
Interesting.
Tell you also how to wipe your, you know what, too. But
Yes, yes, they do. That's actually in Tractate Berakhot, though. That's in Berakhot where they talk about that.
it's a little less used nowadays. But
Yeah, and we can get into why it's less used these days, but that we don't have to do that now. So we've talked all around the Mishnah, but we haven't actually looked at what's in it. And this is texts on Tuesday, so we should be looking at texts. So Sharira Gaon says, Torah is being lost, so we need to preserve it. Let's write it down. And the real question that we should ask is he right? Because this is the story the rabbis tell about the Mishnah as well. People only tell the stories when they're forced that do them the most credit, which lets you know that I think that this is not the whole story. So the Mishnah, terminology, the Mishnah is the whole thing. A Mishnah, in lowercase, is one individual block from the Mishnah. So if I turn to Berakhot 1:1 in my Hebrew book, after I get through all of these introductions, so this is page 1 of the beginning of the Mishnah. And right here, there's an aleph that tells me this is the start of a Mishnah. And it doesn't end until the top of the next sheet, the top of the next page. So that was Mishnah 1 of Berakhot chapter 1. So the Hebrew word for chapter is perek. It's backwards. Well, that's because it's in Hebrew. So an individual Mishnah is the individual block of teaching. The chapter is called a perek. So it'll be perek 1, perek echad, Mishnah echad, right? 1:1. So you do it like you do biblical verses, right? Genesis 1:1, Berakhot 1:1. And here's the very first Mishnah. I've got it in English and in Hebrew. We won't see Hebrew again after this. I may have a cover page photo in there or something. We'll see maybe some Hebrew letters, but you don't have to read any of it. So it starts off, there's no introduction to this book. It says, from what time do they recite the Shema in the evening? From the hour when the Kohanim go in to eat of their teruma until the end of the first watch, the words of Rabbi Eliezer, and the sages say until midnight. And Rabban Gamliel says until the ray of dawn arises. It happened that his sons came from a feast, and they said to him, we have not recited. And he said to them, if the ray of dawn has not arisen, you are obligated to recite. Not only that, English is backwards, Hebrew came first. Well, yes, I know Hebrew came first. But how many of us are reading Hebrew on this chat right now? So he says to them, if the ray of dawn hasn't arisen, you must recite. And not only that, but every time the sages say, midnight, actually, you have until the first ray of dawn. And if that's the case, why say until midnight? To keep people from sinning. So I just want to briefly, we'll look at this again on its own. I just want to briefly have you note something. So I've bolded some words in Hebrew down here. And I bolded them for a reason. If you look here, if you know your Hebrew alphabet, you know that this long letter hanging down is a final nun. If you don't know your Hebrew alphabet, you now know that that long letter is a final nun. If you look over here, this sort of square, sort of round is a final mem. Hebrew cares about gender. These are both masculine gendered words. But Hebrew doesn't use a final nun to mark plurals like this. Aramaic does. These guys couldn't keep their Hebrew and Aramaic straight enough to use the right endings. This is how non-functional as a spoken language Hebrew is for them. They can write it, they can read it, they cannot speak it in all likelihood, and they do it over and over again. So here's another mem, but here's a nun. And the way that they write some of these words is not the way Hebrew would have been written at the time either. So this is to say, they are really stuck in Aramaic. They are not Hebrew scholars. This gets stuff all mixed up in terms of grammar, in terms of endings, in terms of all these other things. They can read it, they can write it, but they write it badly. This is not textbook Hebrew. Rabbinic Hebrew is all like this. This mushiness carries on until the 1800s, when Eliezer ben Yehuda finally starts working on modern Hebrew and says, like, enough. Hebrew gets worse over time for many folks. So this is just to say, the rabbis are the beginning of a line of people who don't actually know Hebrew as a living language, and they mess things up. And Aramaic plays a huge role in how they understand Hebrew. But we have this stuff in English. What questions, when we look at this, come to your mind?
Well, one little question. I've got a book thicker than this called Chapman's Piloting that I got yesterday. It was being given away free. And I was thinking this is like the Talmud for boat people. And one of the tracts that may or may not be in Chapman is that there are 3 types of dawn and 3 types of sunset: nautical, astronomical, and the third one. Oh, the people do this.
Yeah.
So
okay,
which dawn are they talking about?
Yeah, which dawn are they talking about? What is dawn? What's the ray of dawn? What's the stuff with a watch? Right? Until the end of the first watch, what's that? What's different between watch and midnight?
Right, and what does he mean when he says, keep you from sinning if it's till midnight versus till dawn?
Yeah, so what's that about?
Right.
What's the Shema?
What's the Shema?
Shema Yisrael.
How much of it is the Shema? How much do you say? You don't know from this, do you?
No.
Why are we starting with the evening?
The evening starts the day.
Right.
But are you sure? How do you know that?
Everyone knows that.
We've learned that. Okay, everybody knows that, except that maybe not. Here's another one. What's teruma?
I don't know.
How much of this?
The sacrificial animal, if it's the kohanim.
But we don't really know that yet, right?
Yeah.
How much of what comes before the words of Rabbi Eliezer are actually the words of Rabbi Eliezer? Right? So we can keep this as like, it's turtles all the way down.
Jeremy, one serious question. The tiny little bit I know of Hebrew, don't know any Aramaic. I was looking at the last sentence there, looking for sin, as in chet, as in target, but I don't see it.
So this last word, avera, down here. So there's multiple words for sin. Avera is transgression, kind of the idea of avar is to step over a boundary. So this is, we've heard the term chet, which means to miss the mark.
Right.
This is avera, which is stepping over a boundary.
Okay.
Transgressing. Yeah.
Thank you.
So it is perfectly legitimate to read this and go, what just happened? It's also perfectly legitimate to read this and think, oh, I know what the Shema is, no problem. And the day begins in the evening. And teruma must be the priestly sacrifice. And I don't understand why they're coming and complicating all of this with all these other times, right? So what's the Shema? You think you know, are you sure? Why are we starting in the evening? Who are the Kohanim? What's Teruma? When is the first watch? How many watches are there? We talked about the Hebrew a little bit. The sages say until midnight. So what are the watches about? When is midnight? How do you measure time when you don't have clocks? Rabban Gamliel says until the ray of dawn arises. Are we done with the watches? Why are we talking about this and not midnight? From the hour when the Kohanim go in to eat their teruma, so did Rabbi Eliezer say all of that? Or did he only say until the end of the first watch? Is there a pattern to the text that helps us figure out what Rabbi Eliezer actually said? So these are all the questions that careful reading of just this paragraph leaves you. What's with Rabban Gamliel's sons? Read this carefully. If the ray of dawn has not yet arisen, you are obligated to recite. So if you wait long enough, do you not have to recite? Do you get an exemption? And not only that, every time they said midnight, actually it's dawn, but we want to keep man distant from transgression. Who said that? Is this Rabban Gamliel saying this to his kids? Or is this something that Rabbi has added to the Mishnah and we don't know? And we still don't actually know which rule is the right rule. When do you start and when do we find out? We do in the Talmud.
You mean in the Gemara?
In the Gemara, which is its own document. We can talk about that separately, but that's more than one. What the heck is that?
Okay, I just made that note because the Mishnah is actually part of the Talmud.
Yes.
The Gemara is the one that goes a lot more into details.
Yes, although they are drastically different documents, and it makes you wonder whether they really should be put together quite like they are. So the Mishnah's answer to all of your questions is to start talking about the morning Shema. It's not going to answer the questions. It's not going to explain everything. It's not going to tell you what basis it has for any of the rules that it suggests. The rules all seem contradictory, and we're just left behind. And Berakhot 1:2 is about the morning Shema. And we have new rules for how you know when the morning Shema is supposed to be said, when you start, when you end. This is the Mishnah's answer. No answer. Move on to the next thing, right? We're preserving oral traditions. This is the rabbi saying, we're just preserving this stuff. It's the Mishnah. We're repeating what we already have said. Jack.
Maybe I missed this, but who's the audience for this? That is to say, how much of a problem was it, all of the difficulties that you've just been pointing out, were they perceived by the audience for this as having those difficulties?
Yes, because every one of these questions, right, we have 3 slides worth of what the heck's going on here. These are all things that show up in the Gemara as part of the discussion about this text. So the audience presumably are current and future rabbis, and they do ask these questions. So it is speaking to its audience, but the audience isn't necessarily the people who would have read this, which is its own thing. Because we think of reading a text, but this is not actually maybe what they did.
What were they losing out on in the previous slide?
Oh, one who reads from that point on does not lose out, like a man who reads in the Torah. So the discussion in the Talmud will develop this, but basically the point is there's 2 kinds of credit for reading the morning Shema. One of them is for reading the Shema, because it's in the Torah and you should read from the Torah. The other one is reading those texts at that time. So there's 2 commandments, and you lose credit for one of them, except that's not clear here. Because it's the Mishnah, it's not going to be clear. This is the article of faith you have to use when you're looking at the Mishnah. It's not clear, not supposed to be clear. The goal is not to actually give me any kind of explanation or foothold for certainty, which is unfortunate. So Nadine, I see your hand up, or virtually see your hand up.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah. So the
Oh, hold on.
So the question, no, that doesn't work either. All right.
Yeah, it did.
Oh, it worked.
Did it?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So you mentioned the midnight, and they didn't have clocks, but they had a concept of time.
Mm-hmm.
So is that what they meant? They meant, how did they?
So it will turn out that halacha has its own set of hours, and they have specific natural phenomena that they think you should be looking out for. Again, in the Talmud, they don't talk about it in the Mishnah. You're sort of supposed to know. Or you're not supposed to know, and the point is you're supposed to learn, and you use the Mishnah as a learning document, maybe. So if you're confused, that's good. You should be.
Oh, good.
This is the right place to be.
Okay.
Horrible for me to say, but absolutely you should be confused. That is totally legitimate. It would be weird if you weren't. Actually, it would mean that you'd already studied the Talmud for this. That's what it would mean. So no answer. We're left with more questions, but we have a structure. From what time do they recite the Shema in the morning? Hour when the priests eat teruma, until, and then we have 3 options for until. If we look at the other one, 1, 2, again, a structure. When do they start? Here are some guides for starting. We don't know which one is right. Here's when you need to finish, but it's okay because maybe it's just reading Torah if you're late. So the Mishnah is mostly going to put things together as, here's a question, here's the rule for it, here's a couple other rules for it, here's maybe another rule, a couple more rules for it. And the language is composed so you can memorize it. I'm going to prove it to you. I need a Hebrew reader to pay attention to the Hebrew text. Me'ematai korinet shema ba'aravi misha'a she'hakohanim nichnasim lecho b'trumatan ad sof ha'ashmura rishona divrei Rabbi Eliezer v'chachamim amrim ad chatzot. Question, answer, 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 answer. Some of these things are actually even mnemonics. So modern scholarship has discovered that there's kind of mnemonics working in this. So I recited to here. I actually know the entire first page of the Talmud by heart. But this is designed to be memorized. The rest of it is not. Don't go memorizing the Talmud. I mean, so Larry and I had a conversation via email about somebody who did memorize the Talmud, but this is not a normal thing for people to go do. So there's a structure. There's a point to this document. There's a use for this document. And the use for the document is to be memorized, not necessarily by the rabbis interpreting it, but by someone whose job is to stand in the Beit Midrash, in the academy, and simply recite the Mishnahs on command. Because not all the rabbis could read. But a few people could read and memorize well enough to be able to recite accurately what's in the Mishnah. So that was a job. So here's another example of it. How do they bless over fruit? Fruit of the tree, you say X, except for wine, you say Y. Fruit of the earth, one says X, except for bread, you say Z. Vegetables, you say A, but this other rabbi says you say B. So that's the flow of much of the Mishnah. We have not seen a biblical verse. We have not seen an explanation of anything. We have seen rules designed for you to memorize. So here's that structure again. Top line issue, rule, exception. Top line issue, rule, exception. Top line issue, rule, exception. If you've ever sat for a bar exam, this is kind of like your outlines for the bar exam or for a law school class. Rule, exception, rule, exception, rule, exception, rule, exception, rule, exception. The explanation is not in your notes because you're supposed to already know how to explain that stuff. But you need to memorize what the rules are, and this is how you do it. So Mishnah statements follow a specific structure. You can have a lot of top-line questions in the Mishnah with structures beneath. Subsequent Mishnayot, that's the plural for Mishnah, may have their own questions. They may fill in details, don't count on it, or they may do both. So we looked at Berakhot 6.1. This was, what do you say for each type of fruit, and what are the exceptions? Berakhot 6.4 says, well, what if you have multiple kinds of fruit? We have an answer in that case. If there are multiple kinds, Rabbi Judah, who we saw above, if one of the 7, these are the 7 species in the land of Israel, if one of the 7 are, you bless over the one of the 7, the sages say, whatever makes you happy. But we don't have actual resolution, we just have, well, here's options. The whole point of the rabbinic enterprise is to explore the options. And I mentioned this other document called the Tosefta. The Tosefta is additions. So this is, and it tracks the structure of the Mishnah a little bit, the overall plan. So this is Mishnah Berakhot 1.1 that we've already looked at. This is Tosefta 1.1. From what time do they recite the Shema in the evening? From the hour when the sons of man enter to eat their bread on Shabbat evening, the words of Rabbi Meir. Almost an exactly identical structure, different answer. And the sages say, from the hour when the Kohanim are eligible to eat their truma, are we sure? Rabbi Eliezer said that. Which one of these is right? They don't agree. An indication of the matter is in the coming out of the stars, and even though there's no proof, there's a reference. Half of them were holding spears from the morning twilight until the coming of the stars. We have a proof text. We don't normally see this in the Mishnah, but we see it in the Tosefta. We have an explanation of something. This is an explanation for why we're talking about the evening first. So the Tosefta's got a different agenda. So what's the Mishnah doing? Frames legal disputes in a structure, offers a sequence of solutions, memorizable, establishes some level of consistent terminology, provides possible resolutions, but doesn't actually say what the resolution is, doesn't explain its terminology, it just establishes it, doesn't identify rationales, doesn't identify sources most of the time, and states positions that must be incorrect because they don't agree. At least on the face, they don't agree. This is the founding structure of Rabbinic Judaism. This is the document from which everything else really comes. And it is as confusing and self-contradictory as you can imagine, which actually makes it the perfect founding document for an awful lot of Jews, because it can't agree with itself. What's the Tosefta doing? This other one over here on the right. The Tosefta is preserving alternate traditions that might be redundant. It's preserving rationales, it's preserving scripture, less curation and more argumentation. It doesn't have that structure that we saw forced on what's in it. It kind of looks at the structure a little bit, but it's got other stuff going on. It's a separate document. So what's the Mishnah up to? Rav Sharira says, well, it's preserving traditions. And we can see that. right? It's got a bunch of different traditions, and it doesn't usually weigh in on which one's right. But why would you keep so many wrong answers around? Memorize for repetition, definitely. That's the structure of it, but why those teachings? So in law school classes, you're taught rules that are out of date because you're being taught to think about law and you're not really being taught the law. So maybe that's what's going on with the Mishnah. Stabilization, but if you want stability, why do you preserve dissent? And why don't you explain why? Right, so all of the traditional explanations don't fully work. So we look at these things again, and we're noticing, okay, more details, less stuff, different attributions of the same rule. What's going on? So the ray of dawn arises, which is the rule for all the midnight stuff. So this is a subdivision of midnight. When men eat bread, are these the same time? We don't actually know. We assume they're different. Oops. And the Tosefta never offers a rule. And then further down, in the next piece of the Tosefta, it actually suggests, Rabbi Shimon says, sometimes a person recites the Shema twice in one night. Once before the ray of dawn arises and once after. And when he does that, he takes care of both the evening and the morning. So you can recite the Shema twice in one night and have two different time frames covered. That's pretty weird. And that suggests that you could actually recite the Shema late. You can go past dawn. That's pretty quirky compared to the structure that the Mishnah puts on it. So if we can do all the comparison, Rabbi Meir's name is, and his rule is omitted from the Mishnah. There's a guide for figuring out times, but it may not be quite right. Scriptural basis that the Tosefta has, not even in the Mishnah. Mishnah has fixed opinions for when things end. The Tosefta kind of implies some opinions at some point. You're supposed to figure out, oh, well, maybe midnight's not the rule. Maybe it really is dawn. Maybe Rabban Gamliel's right. I would ask if you're confused to raise your hand, but I'm just going to assume that most people are confused, and that's good. Okay. Here's what it's really up to. This is a political document too. We're not just preserving, we're not just educating, we're not just stabilizing. We're defining limits on rules. We're settling scores. We're pulling halakha in a more conservative direction, right? More stringent rules to keep people far from transgression. We're detaching halakha from scripture. If the main text that you're studying never cites a biblical verse, that says something about how important the biblical texts actually are. They're not as important for the rabbis because they interpret things away and they know that there are contradictions and they deal with them. So here's how we know that there's some political scores being settled. There's a rightward pull on halakha. Rabbi Meir's name is omitted from the Mishnah. Rabbi Meir's rule may provide more time for the evening Shema, and Rabbi Meir tried to eject Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's father from being Nasi. If you don't like him, you leave his name out as much as you can. So his tradition was left out here. The Talmud gets back at this by saying every single unsourced statement in the Mishnah is actually Rabbi Meir. Not Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi who put the thing together, but Rabbi Meir. Scriptural basis in the Tosefta is omitted. The Tosefta's provision of a proof text suggests an older point of origin. The Mishnah is really well organized and slick. The more well organized and slick a document is, the more it tells you it's been worked on, the newer it might be. So the Tosefta stuff might be old rules. And Yehuda HaNasi saw them and said, not those. I'm going to report these other ones. Again, we're settling political scores. We're pulling halakha to the right. And I want to show you, we'll go back to, this is our Mishnah that we started with. So the Talmud will decide that everything from to teruma doesn't belong to Rabbi Eliezer. It's unsourced, which therefore the Talmud says means that all of this is Rabbi Meir. And Judah Hanasi edited him out. He knew there was a rule, but we're going to leave it out. We're going to report somebody else's rule. We're going to attribute it to the wrong person. The sages are going to say when the Kohanim go in to eat the Truma, we're attributing it to the sages, not Rabbi Meir. And the Talmud says, no, that's Rabbi Meir. It's all Rabbi Meir up until that spot. So this is the score settling that's happening in the Mishnah, right? It is a profoundly political document too. But what you've seen is this document doesn't make sense all by itself, really. It's preserving a bunch of traditions. It's intended to be debated over. It's intended to be memorized. It's trying to sculpt who gets talked about. We're excluding Rabbi Meir from this because there's personal animus. There are other places where we can't avoid Rabbi Meir, so we're going to name him. But when we can, we leave him out, and the Talmud puts him back in, even though Rabbi Meir can't have said one of these. So which one is it? So the Talmud has to be wrong about Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir, from the hour when the sons of man enter to eat their bread on Shabbat evenings, the sages, when they go in to eat their truma, right? We have a bunch of contradictions in what the rules are. Rabbi Meir can't have said one of these. We don't actually know which one he said and which one he didn't. Maybe the Tosefta is right, maybe the Mishnah is right. We don't know. But we do know that this text is now playing politics. It's preserving stuff for multiple uses, but it's got an agenda. And it probably represents a newer way of preserving and transmitting halakha from what came before, which is you'd cite a verse from the Torah and you'd explain it, or you'd have an explanation and then you'd cite a verse from the Torah. So the stuff we saw in the Tosefta is older, probably. Nobody was there to write it down, so we don't really know. And rule number one in biblical studies, if you find a letter saying, this is how we did it, it's a forgery. Always rule number one. Don't believe it when it explains itself. That's bad. Okay, so that's like a light speed introduction to the Mishnah, so that if you ever pick it up in English, you can have some sense of what it's trying to do. It's trying to be the start of something. It is not the end result. It's not a reference book. So you will sometimes see people refer to the Mishnah or to the Talmud as a fundamental book of Jewish law. Yeah, good luck figuring out what the rule is. There's no end of the debates, really. So now that you're very confused, questions? I think I see Larry's fingers. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let me try and keep this short. It just occurs to me. It sounds like it's irrational, illogical, contradictory. How could anyone? Can I share my screen for a minute?
Oh, yeah.
It seems similar to some American stuff. Like we based our laws on the English laws, but we had a revolution, so we were going to skew our legal system a little bit toward independence. So we have the founding fathers, and by the way, our laws about women were also written by men. But anyway, we had the founding fathers, and they commissioned Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence, and they do that, and then years go by, and they write the Constitution, which disregards the Declaration, because that was never enacted into law, and then the Constitution is the basis for all the laws, and we should understand it. So we have a short rule, which gives its own reason for being, to have a well-regulated militia necessary for the security of the free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So then we have different circuits, different times, different people, different circuit courts, sending it up to the Supreme Court, which comes back to it every 30 or 50 years to pitch it the way that court pitches it, and that's the law. So it seems very human somehow. I'm not going to argue the law with a lawyer or the Talmud with a rabbi, which are both, but
that seems unfair, doesn't it?
You should write the guide to the perplexed.
Perplexed, yeah. I'll guide them. So I don't, I'm just, okay, thank you.
Yeah. So the big difference to see between the Constitution and the Mishnah is the Constitution, they thought you would understand it. And they didn't really plan on embedding really contradictory things right next to each other, because it wasn't designed as like a law school outline that you debate. It was, okay, these are really the rules, figure them out, as opposed to, here are 5 possible rules.
Yeah, different
fight over the 5
for
rules.
Sure.
And it's important to remember that the founders didn't think they were dealing with a divine document. The rabbis really do think that this is the Torah. There is actually a book by Abraham Joshua Heschel, who we know for the prophets and Shabbat and all of his mystical stuff, but he was also legitimately a philosophical scholar. And he wrote a book called Torah from Heaven through the looking glass of it's essentially through the looking glass of oral Torah. And his point is, the rabbis really think this is divine law that they're saying as they're saying it. They're not engaging in what the founders did, which is, okay, we know we're making a new thing. The rabbis really think that they're pulling out old law that's been forgotten, which, somewhat ironically, is a little bit like what a lot of common law judges in the US and British systems thought they were doing until the 20th century. That they thought they were discovering the law as opposed to making the law in many cases.
Well,
so
the originalists think something like, some of the originalists are said to think something like that.
Yeah. I don't think that's true for the originalists. I don't think it's true for the rabbis either. I recognize that their self-image is a particular thing, but I don't think that's what was happening. Not really.
Right. So can I ask about how this is being used today? I'm picturing all these, boys in the yeshivas, or is this what they're sitting around arguing about? And how did people make sense of this to figure out, okay, I should actually say the Shema at this time of day,
Yeah, so the normal course of a yeshiva education, boys start to study this around age 10 or 11. It's largely for memorization purposes.
Okay.
And when they're 13, they start studying Talmud. And that's when the learning matters. So many people will never again, after the age of 13, read the Mishnah all by itself to learn Mishnah.
Interesting.
They read it through the lens of the Gemara, through the lens of the whole Talmud, and medieval legal codes, and responses by rabbis who are asked specific questions. However, there are adult study groups that study the Mishnah. There are yeshivas that are somewhat comfortable with the idea of women not studying Talmud, but maybe they'll study the Mishnah. The Mishnah itself has commentaries around the edges.
Right.
So the inside is written by a 16th century scholar, Ovadia of Bartanura. So if you've ever bought Bartanura wine, it's named after his family.
Wow.
So this is the most important commentary on the Mishnah, and then there's a secondary one out on the side. Nothing is ever studied without its commentary.
Okay.
And it's studied more and more by conservative, reform, and reconstructionist rabbis who are looking for older, more liberal opinions to be able to root a more lenient approach in a text. So it gets used for that as well. For us, it's still the language of Judaism, even if it's not our practice. So our Rosh Hashanah service still has a chunk of the Shema in it. Now we've rewritten it a lot, but it's there because people remember that there's a Shema, and that's the Shema that's in here. We still do things that are very Yom Kippur-like. On Yom Kippur, they come from somewhere. They don't come from the Tanakh. They come from the Mishnah and the Talmud. So even the things that we've highly modernized, their roots are planted in this thing from over 1800 years ago.
Wow.
This very human, very political, self-contradicting document should be all the proof anybody needs that Judaism changes over time.
Right.
And yet, there are people who insist that it has not changed over time. I can't make people see the evidence in front of them and using Occam's razor.
Right. What can you do?
Can't fix that.
Thank you.
So everybody's going to run out and study Mishnah, right?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you are really inclined to do so, the best way of doing it in English is the conservative movement. You know, it has Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and they have a school in Israel called the Conservative Yeshiva. And the Conservative Yeshiva has I can't remember if it's daily or weekly, study of the Mishnah. And they send you like 2 or 3 bits of Mishnah and dissect the heck out of the thing. Bring in the background from the Talmud so you don't have to know it. That's probably the easiest way of actually making this accessible. Otherwise, it's a bunch of rules that seem out of nowhere.
Right.
The book starts out of nowhere and it ends the same way. It's just not, you don't read it cover to cover. There's no narrative. I mean, other than these little stories about, you know, Rabban Gamliel's sons who come back from a party and he says, oh, you still have time to recite the Shema. Not a lot of stories. The Talmud has weird stories in it. If you need weird stories, go to the Talmud.
That's where you go.
Rabbis who mark out graves, and then after they die, wizards come along and they come back to life and pull the wizard's beards. I mean, there is all kinds of weird stuff in the Talmud. If you want weird stories,
Right.
the Talmud is for you.
That's great.
Well, so question, it seems daunting to codify and simplify it. I wouldn't do it, but great Jewish scholars have done that with a lot of material, the Guide to the Perplexed, the Shulchan Aruch.
Mhm.
So couldn't someone or some group, maybe including women, do the same here? I understand there's not much of an audience for it. It wouldn't pay. It would cost hundreds of dollars. Who would print it, etc. But they were the previous codifiers were just as impractical in a sense. So how do you think that will ever happen? Is there a need for it?
I would suspect the answer is no, because what the people who put together later legal codes would tell you is that that's exactly what they were doing. So Maimonides has the Guide to the Perplexed, and that's actually like a philosophical treatise. But he writes a commentary on the Mishnah, which he writes in Arabic.
Huh.
The only thing Maimonides ever wrote in Hebrew is called, get ready, the Mishnah Torah, which sounds very much like Mishnah, does it not? He calls it the Mishnah Torah, and he is therefore saying, I have repeated the Torah. I've clarified it, and I've written the rules so you can understand it all. And you'll never have to study Talmud again. That was like part of the promise. And then a commentator came along and looked at it and said, well, actually you got this wrong and 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 this wrong. And you didn't read the Talmud on that section because you got that wrong. And so a whole set of footnotes got added. So now you can't buy the Mishnah Torah as a book without getting the guy's footnotes.
How about
So
the Shulchan Aruch?
Shulchan Aruch can't get that without the commentaries either. Except if you buy the English translation of the Shulchan Aruch in the Yale Library of Jewish Texts, which are library cost volumes, right? $200 a pop. Nobody actually buy these things. There is a translation of the Shulchan Aruch that doesn't have all the footnotes and the comments. But nothing gets studied by itself in a traditional context. So yeah, Maimonides thought that's what he was doing, and then somebody came along and said, well, no, not actually. And that's what Joseph Caro thought he was doing when he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, until somebody came along and said, well, that's only for Sephardic Jews. Right, so there's always a difference, which again, living tradition. Always changing. Which, if you're Orthodox, you're supposed to think isn't changing. One note of trivia about, so I mentioned David Weiss Halivni, who is retired mostly, but was a professor at Jewish Theological Seminary at Columbia University. So you will occasionally hear stories about scholars who, if you put a pin through a volume of Talmud, they can tell you what letter is on each side of the page around the pin. This guy is literally one of those people. So he grew up in an orphanage in New York after coming over from Eastern Europe, and he made money by being able to do that because he had a photographic memory. So he would know when you put the pin through letter whatever, oh, here's what's on the other side of that, and the other side of that, and the other side of that.
Wow. Impressive.
So there are people like that. There's not a lot of people like that. Other questions? I can't promise that the next 2 weeks are going to bring any more clarity because we're studying Spinoza.
Oh.
So specifically what we'll look at is the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, which is the theological and political treatise. This is where Spinoza does his proof of God, but not the God you're thinking of. Here's what you really ought to be doing with the Tanakh. And oh, by the way, there's definitely multiple authors to this thing. His argument for secular society, this is the book that really does that. So I've allocated 2 weeks for it. We obviously won't be reading the whole thing. I'm also not going to assign you homework, although I can tell you where you can get a free translation of it, because he wrote in Dutch, or Latin rather, he wrote in Latin. There is a translation of it freely available that's relatively recent. I can't vouch for the quality because I've never read the original. I will tell you that I bought a translation from Cambridge University so that I had something that had a little bit of vetting.
What should we read? Is that the Cambridge?
So I'll be putting passages from the Cambridge one up on the PowerPoint. So you don't have to read anything.
No, but it helps to prepare. Is there one book on, Wit and Wisdom of Spinoza with biographical footnotes, an introduction to Spinoza?
There is a book. I want to make sure that I'm getting the title of it right. So there's a book called Betraying Spinoza, written by Rebecca Goldstein.
Oh.
Rebecca Goldstein is Steven Pinker's spouse. And she is a philosophy professor. And she wrote a biography of Spinoza that also talks about his argument for secular society and modernity, and also gets at some of the interesting background details of his life. So I definitely recommend, for a reader-friendly thing, that as opposed to, head to your local bookstore and pick up your copy of Spinoza from the philosophy section.
Well, we can't do that now anyhow, so.
Now you think that the Barnes & Noble near me is open.
How is that possible?
Really?
It has a cafe.
Oh.
And it is open for business in all other respects, so far as I can tell. There are only ever like 3 cars in front of it, but it is open. You can go to the Ellicott City Barnes & Noble and pick up a copy of Spinoza, assuming it's in stock.
Wow.
You can go to your public library.
Or you could go to, you can't go to your public library.
No, I mean, you can't. I work for them. We're not open.
Nope. I bought a Kindle version. But I will actually send out a link with a link to a PDF. That's a fairly recent translation that is probably good enough. Not great, but probably good enough.
Thank you.
And there are probably some public domain English translations at this point, but the English will be kind of, 1910s-ish. So a little harder to work with. Okay, so that's the Mishnah in slightly under an hour and a half.
Thank you.
How many feet were you standing on?
Yes.
How many feet am I I am sitting on a chair. That's what I'm standing on.